On a cold morning in the spring of 1946, something strange was happening in Canada. Trains were ready, ships were waiting at the ports, papers were signed, the war was over, German prisoners of war were finally free to go home. And yet thousands of them refused to leave. Not one or two, not 100. Nearly 6,000 German POWs said no. No to returning to Germany. No to seeing their families. No to rebuilding their shattered homeland. They chose to stay in the country that had once held them behind barbed wire. This decision confused the Canadian government, shocked military officials, and raised one haunting question that still echoes today. Why would defeated enemy soldiers refuse freedom and choose captivity in a foreign land? To understand this, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when the world was on fire and Canada was quietly preparing for a war it never wanted but could not avoid. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Canada declared war on Nazi Germany just 10 days later on September 10th. At first, the war felt far away, but soon German U-boats were prowling the Atlantic and Canadian ships were sinking. By 1940, captured German sailors and soldiers began arriving on Canadian soil. Canada was chosen because it was far from the front lines, safe from air raids, and had vast open land perfect for prison camps. The first large group of German POWs arrived in July 1940, following the fall of France. Many were Luftwaffe airmen shot down over Britain, U-boat crew members captured at sea, and later Afrika Korps soldiers taken after battles in North Africa. They were transported across the Atlantic under heavy guard and unloaded in ports like Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Quebec City. From there, they were sent by train to camps scattered across the country, from Ontario to Alberta, from Quebec to New Brunswick. One of the largest camps was Camp 133 near Lethbridge, Alberta, opened in 1942. Another major facility was Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario. There was Camp 132 near Medicine Hat, which would later become infamous for housing some of the most hardcore Nazi prisoners. By 1944, Canada was holding more than 34,000 German POWs. They were guarded by the Veterans Guard of Canada, many of them older soldiers who had fought in World War I. Life inside the camps was not what many Germans expected. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, POWs had to be treated humanely, and Canada followed the rules closely. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care, warm clothing and shelter. They were allowed to play sports, stage theatre shows, form orchestras, and even publish camp newspapers. Many camps had libraries stocked with German books. Some prisoners attended classes in math, engineering, and English. Compared to the ruins of Europe, these camps were orderly, calm, and safe. But there was a darker side inside the wire. Among the prisoners were loyal Nazis, some holding ranks like Oberleutnant, Hauptmann, and even former SS members. These men enforced Nazi discipline within the camps. Prisoners suspected of being anti-Nazi or too friendly with Canadians were threatened, beaten, and in some cases murdered. At Camp 132 in Medicine Hat, several prisoners were killed by fellow Germans for opposing Hitler. One of the most infamous cases was the murder of Corporal Karl Lehmann on September 22, 1943. His crime was being labelled a traitor. Canadian authorities were aware of these tensions and eventually separated hardline Nazis from more moderate prisoners. But the damage was done. Fear and ideology shaped many prisoners' minds long after the guards locked the gates each night. As the war turned against Germany in 1944 and 1945, news filtered into the camps. Prisoners listened to radios, read newspapers, and received Red Cross messages. They learned about the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. They heard about the fall of Berlin in May 1945. And slowly they began to understand what awaited them back home. Germany was no longer the country they remembered. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden and Berlin lay in ruins. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 alone killed tens of thousands. Food was scarce. Housing was destroyed. Millions were refugees. The country was divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. For soldiers who had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht, the future was uncertain and frightening. Many POWs feared arrest, interrogation, or forced labour if they returned. The fear of Soviet captivity was especially strong. Soldiers from Eastern Germany, or those who had fought on the Eastern Front, knew the stories. Soviet POW camps had brutal reputations. Some German soldiers believed returning home meant years of punishment or even death. At the same time, life in Canada had begun to change them. Starting in 1943, Canada faced a serious labour shortage. Thousands of Canadian men were overseas fighting, and farms and industries needed workers. The government decided to use POW labour under controlled conditions. German prisoners were sent to work on farms, in lumber camps, and in factories. They were paid small wages, credited to accounts they could use at camp canteens. Many farmers treated them kindly, sometimes better than hired hands before the war. In rural Ontario, Alberta, and Manitoba, German POWs worked side by side with Canadians. They milked cows, harvested wheat, chopped wood, and repaired equipment. Over time, barriers softened. Prisoners practiced English. Canadians learned German words. Conversations began. Trust grew. Some prisoners were invited into farmhouses for meals. Others attended local dances under guard. A few even fell in love. While official rules forbade romantic relationships, they happened anyway. Letters were exchanged. Promises were made. For many prisoners, Canada stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a second home. By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, many POWs had spent up to 5 years in Canada. For young soldiers captured in 1940 or 1941, Canada had become the place where they spent their entire adulthood. They had learned skills, formed friendships, and imagined futures there. Going back to a destroyed Germany felt like stepping into darkness. Repatriation plans began quickly after the war ended. In late 1945 and early 1946, Canadian authorities prepared to send German POWs home in stages. Most prisoners were eager to return. But then came the unexpected resistance. At camps across Canada, especially in Ontario and Alberta, thousands of German POWs quietly expressed the same wish. They did not want to leave. Some openly refused to board trains. Others submitted formal requests to remain in Canada as civilians. The number shocked officials. Nearly 6,000 men wanted to stay. This was not an organised protest. There were no riots or violent resistance. Instead, it was a calm, collective decision driven by fear, hope, and opportunity. One key reason was economic reality. Canada in 1946 was booming. Farms needed workers. Construction was expanding. Industries were converting from wartime production to civilian goods. Jobs were available. Food was plentiful. In contrast, Germany faced hunger and unemployment. Rationing would continue for years. Many POWs believed they had a better chance to build a future in Canada. Another reason was political fear. Germany was undergoing denazification. Former soldiers were being questioned about their roles in the war. While most Wehrmacht soldiers were not war criminals, the process was unpredictable. Some POWs feared being falsely accused or punished simply for serving. There was also shame. Some men did not want to return to face families after defeat. Others had lost everything. Homes destroyed, parents dead, wives missing. Canada offered a clean slate. Canadian officials were torn. On one hand, international. Law required POWs to be repatriated. On the other hand, Canada needed immigrants and workers. After long discussions, the government made a historic decision. German POWs could apply to stay in Canada, but only after being officially released and deported to Germany first. From there, they could apply to return as immigrants. This was frustrating but fair. Many POWs agreed. They returned to Germany in 1946 and 1947, only to apply again. Thousands were approved. By the early 1950s, former German POWs were arriving back in Canada, not as prisoners, but as free men. They settled across the country. They became farmers, carpenters, engineers, and business owners. They married Canadian women. They raised families. Some rarely spoke of the war. Others shared their stories quietly with children and grandchildren. In places like Lethbridge, Kitchener, and Medicine Hat, former POWs became respected members of the community. A few even joined the Canadian Armed Forces later in life. Their accents faded. Their past became history. The story of the 6,000 German POWs who refused to leave Canada is not a story of loyalty to an enemy nation or rejection of home. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and human choice. War had taken everything familiar from them. Canada gave them something unexpected: stability. Today, few Canadians realize that their neighbors, teachers, or grandparents once wore German uniforms behind barbed wire. Fewer still know that when freedom finally came, thousands chose not to go home. And that decision, made quietly in the shadow of history, reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes, the place that holds you prisoner becomes the place that sets you free. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.